A group of rowdy bikers thought they could intimidate anyone on the luxurious ocean liner, but they had no idea the quiet, unassuming passenger they targeted was a decorated Marine with a past forged in combat. When their pranks escalate into threats, they cross a line that unleashes a force they've never faced before. This Marine is trained, disciplined, and unstoppable. They chose the wrong target, and now the consequences will ripple through the entire ship in ways they never expected. The ocean shimmered under the late afternoon sun as the massive cruise ship slowly pulled away from the dock. Families gathered along the railings, waving to loved ones left behind, while couples took selfies against the vast, endless sea. The atmosphere was one of celebration and leisure. People were ready to relax, to escape their daily routines and let the gentle rhythm of the waves carry their worries away. But for John Kane, this voyage wasn't about luxury or escape. It was about finding peace after years of silent battles. John Kane stood quietly near the stern of the ship, his gaze locked on the fading coastline. Broad-shouldered, with a build that hinted at years of rigorous training, he carried himself with the calm composure of a man who had seen things few could understand. His Marine service had shaped him, refined him into a figure of control and discipline. Now retired, Kane hoped this trip would allow him to finally let go of the constant vigilance that haunted his every move. But old habits lingered. He still scanned his surroundings, noting the exits, the staff positions, and the clusters of passengers forming social circles. The scent of salt hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of grilled food from the upper deck's buffet. Laughter echoed as children splashed in the pool, and the upbeat rhythm of a steel drum band played softly in the background. But Kane's attention shifted when he noticed a loud group boarding late. A dozen men in matching leather jackets, some with long beards and tattoos snaking up their necks, made their entrance known. They were laughing, cursing loudly, and shoving one another as they made their way onto the deck. The patch on the back of their jackets read, "Hell's Serpents." Kane recognized the type instantly, bikers who thrived on dominance and attention. At first, they were just part of the scenery. Kane wasn't one to judge a book by its cover. He knew plenty of men who wore leather and rode motorcycles but were decent, respectful people. But this group felt different. They carried a palpable air of entitlement, a desire to be noticed, to establish control wherever they went. It didn't take long for the disruptions to start. Razor, their apparent leader, a heavily scarred man with a steel chain around his neck, seemed to thrive on making others uncomfortable. At dinner, they commandeered a large table and made crude jokes loud enough for nearby families to hear. Kane noted how the waitstaff avoided confrontation, even when Razor banged his mug on the table demanding more drinks. Kane remained in the background, choosing a quiet spot near the window, silently observing. Years of service had taught him how to blend in, to be present without drawing attention. But that didn't mean he was unaware. His instincts were already cataloging the group's behavior, mapping out the potential flashpoints of conflict. When a young waiter accidentally spilled a glass of water on Razor's jeans, the entire group erupted in laughter, except Razor himself. His face twisted with anger as he yanked the waiter closer by the collar. "You think that's funny, kid? Clean it up, now." The boy stammered, clearly panicked. Kane could feel the heat rising in his chest, but kept still. It wasn't his moment to intervene. Yet. The waiter apologized profusely and fled, while the bikers howled in amusement. The evening pressed on, the tension simmering beneath the surface. Kane had hoped this trip would be a mental reset, a chance to unwind without the shadows of his past following him. But the atmosphere was shifting. He could feel it. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He wasn't looking for conflict, but if it came knocking, Kane was prepared for whatever storm the serpents were foolish enough to bring. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm, orange glow across the open ocean as the cruise ship sailed deeper into the vast blue. The energy on the deck remained lively, kids laughing, couples sipping cocktails, and the steel drum band playing tropical tunes. But beneath the cheerful facade, Kane's eyes stayed alert. He had spent the last 2 decades training his mind to catch the subtle cues most people missed. The Hell's serpents were becoming louder. Razor and his gang had migrated to the poolside bar, claiming a section as their own. Kane watched as they barked drink orders, laughing obnoxiously at their own jokes while making a spectacle of themselves. Most passengers kept their distance, but a few curious onlookers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to say something or let the disturbance go unchecked. Kane kept to himself, leaning against the railing as he nursed a glass of water. His time in the Marines had taught him the importance of restraint. Not every fight was worth engaging, but when Razor started harassing a young couple, Kane knew the dynamic was shifting. A young father, no older than 30, was attempting to calm his toddler, who had dropped a stuffed animal near the biker's feet. The child began to cry, her face scrunching in distress. The father approached cautiously, offering a polite, "Excuse me, could I just grab that, please?" Razor looked down at the plush toy, then slowly ground his boot into it, sneering. "Oops, looks like the bear took a beating. Maybe you should teach your kid to be more careful." The father hesitated, his face turning pale as the other bikers snickered. Kane saw it, the power play. Razor was testing boundaries, seeing just how far he could push without consequence. That was his mistake. Kane moved, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. Stepping between the father and Razor, he crouched down, lifted the stuffed bear from under Razor's boot, and dusted it off. Then he handed it back to the grateful father. "It's all good," Kane said calmly, his voice steady and controlled. "Enjoy your evening." The father nodded, clutching the bear, and hurried back to his family. Razor's smile twisted into a scowl. His pride had been challenged, and he wasn't the type to let things slide. "Hey, hero," Razor growled, taking a step forward. "You got something you want to say? Or you just like playing tough guy for show?" Kane met his gaze, unflinching. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He didn't need to. "I don't play games." For a heartbeat, the two men locked eyes. The other bikers quieted, sensing the sudden shift in tension. Razor clenched his jaw, but Kane could see the conflict in his eyes. Uncertainty. Razor was used to dominating situations, but Kane wasn't reacting the way most people would. There was no fear, no bluster, just calm, collected power. After a long pause, Razor scoffed and backed off, muttering under his breath as he returned to his group. The tension lingered, but for the moment, the confrontation had passed. Kane exhaled quietly, returning to his spot by the railing. He hadn't come here to make enemies, but something told him Razor wasn't the kind of man to let a slight go unpunished. This wasn't over. Not yet. The ocean breeze carried a calm rhythm that rippled across the deck, but for Kane, the tension lingered beneath the surface like a dormant storm. Night had fallen, and the ship's exterior lights shimmered against the black waves stretching endlessly into the horizon. Most passengers were enjoying the after-dinner shows, laughing at the comedians or losing themselves in music. But Kane's focus remained sharp. Razor hadn't forgotten. From his vantage point near the observation deck, Kane noticed Razor and his crew had spread out, lingering in small groups around the pool and bar. They were drinking harder now, the volume of their conversations rising with every round. Razor, however, remained sober, focused. His gaze would drift toward Kane from time to time, a silent challenge in the way his lips curled at the edges. The leader of the Hell's Serpents wasn't finished testing him. He was preparing for something bigger. Kane wasn't worried, at least not for himself. He had dealt with men like Razor before, predators who mistook kindness for weakness, mistook silence for submission. But Kane knew better. And he also knew Razor wouldn't be able to let the earlier confrontation go without reasserting dominance. It started subtly. A waiter delivering drinks to Kane's table seemed unusually nervous, avoiding eye contact as he set down the glass of water. Kane noticed the trembling in his hands, the darting glances toward the serpents. When Kane lifted the glass for a sip, he caught the bitter, pungent scent immediately. Alcohol. Vodka. Not a lethal prank, but a message. Kane set the glass down gently, his expression unchanging. His mind raced, cataloging the behaviors. Razor wasn't just trying to humiliate him. He was testing reactions, probing for weaknesses. The next test came even bolder. As Kane walked toward the lower deck, passing near the lounge area, a heavy-set biker named Tank accidentally bumped into him, nearly spilling his drink all over Kane's chest. "Watch it, tough guy," Tank sneered, his lip curling as he loomed close. Kane didn't flinch. He met Tank's gaze levelly but said nothing. No reaction. No escalation. The silence made Tank uncomfortable. He muttered a curse under his breath and backed away, but not without shooting a glance toward Razor, who had been watching the entire interaction from across the room. Kane knew exactly what was happening. Razor was gauging him, seeing if he would break, lose his cool. But Kane wasn't a man who reacted on impulse. He had been trained to control his breathing under fire, to resist the urge for emotional responses. Years of service had forged him into steel, and this petty mind game was nothing compared to the battlefield. But Razor didn't stop there. Later that night, when Kane returned to his cabin, he noticed it immediately. The door slightly ajar. He entered cautiously, scanning for signs of disturbance. Nothing broken, no damage. But his belongings had been rifled through, his suitcase half unzipped, his shaving kit overturned. On the nightstand, a single note had been left behind, scrawled in rough handwriting. "Nice place. Shame if something happened to it." Kane folded the note neatly and placed it in his pocket. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew what it meant. Razor was crossing a line now. No longer just pranks. This was a test of control. He stood in the center of his cabin for a long moment, breathing slowly. The younger, more reckless version of himself might have confronted Razor then and there. But Kane had learned restraint. This wasn't the time to react. Not yet. Instead, he sat down at the small desk, pulled out a notepad, and began quietly sketching the layout of the ship. Points of entry, weak spots, escape routes. Kane wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing to end one. The rhythmic hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the walls of Kane's cabin, a low, steady pulse beneath the surface calm. The scent of salt lingered, mixing with the coolness of the night air drifting in from the small balcony. But inside his mind, there was no calm. Only focus, the steady calculation of a man who had spent years mastering control. Sitting at the small desk in his cabin, Kane's fingers traced the edges of the threatening note Razor's crew had left behind. He stared at the jagged handwriting, unbothered. This wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was clarity. He wasn't just a retired Marine. His past had forged him into something far more dangerous than Razor could comprehend. The memory came uninvited. Flashes of the desert heat, the sting of sand caught in his eyes. Years ago, in the unforgiving landscapes of Afghanistan, Kane had served in a specialized Marine reconnaissance unit tasked with deep infiltration missions that demanded precision and restraint. He had seen real threats, men with no mercy, terrorist cells who didn't play games, they took lives. He remembered one mission with brutal clarity. A hostile village, civilians caught in the crossfire. His unit had orders to secure a rogue militant leader responsible for dozens of deaths. It was supposed to be a silent operation. No attention drawn, no casualties. But plans rarely survived first contact. A trap had been set. Improvised explosives, snipers hidden in the clay rooftops. When the chaos erupted, Kane's instincts had kicked in like a machine. The discipline of years of combat training took over. He had led his team through the fire, neutralizing the threats with efficiency. Lives were saved, but not all. A rookie on his squad, Private Delgado, had been hit. Kane could still hear his ragged breathing as they carried him out under heavy fire. The guilt of that moment never fully left him. It wasn't just about the loss. It was the reminder that violence had a cost, even when justified. And here he was again, a peaceful cruise ship surrounded by civilians with no idea what was brewing just below the surface. Razor didn't understand that poking at Kane wasn't provoking a bar fight. He was waking a sleeping weapon. A quiet knock at the door brought Kane back to the present. His pulse remained steady as he opened it. The ship's head of security, Officer Daniels, stood there, a broad man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a polite but firm expression. "Evening, sir. Everything all right?" Daniels asked, his tone measured but professional. Kane gave a slow nod. "Why do you ask?" Daniels hesitated, then gestured subtly toward the hallway. "There were reports. Some guests mentioned a confrontation near the bar earlier. I was told you were involved?" Kane's expression remained calm. "I de-escalated a situation before it became a problem. No damage, no harm done." Daniels nodded, but Kane could tell the man was already aware of the Hell's Serpent's antics. "Just keep your distance, sir. We try to avoid incidents on board. If anything else happens, come directly to me." Kane appreciated the warning, but Daniels didn't understand who he was dealing with. After the security officer left, Kane returned to his desk, refolding the note Razor had left behind. His pulse hadn't changed. His breathing remained controlled, but his focus had sharpened. The Serpents were playing a game they didn't realize they'd already lost, and Kane wasn't the kind of man to let threats linger. The ship cut smoothly through the open sea, the gentle sway barely noticeable beneath its massive hull. Most passengers remained blissfully unaware of the tension brewing, their focus on sun-soaked relaxation and extravagant buffets. But Kane knew better. Razor and his crew were circling, waiting for an opportunity to provoke him further. Morning sunlight streamed through the panoramic windows of the upper-deck cafe. Kane sat near the edge, his back to the wall as he sipped black coffee, observing. Razor and his men were spread across multiple tables near the bar, laughing loudly, exaggerating their gestures. Kane noticed how they kept glancing his way. It wasn't the loudness that concerned him. It was the focus. Today, they had escalated from minor pranks to open displays of intimidation. Razor's second-in-command, a thick-set man called Tank, had been staring Kane down for the last 20 minutes. When Kane met his eyes, Tank muttered something to the others and Razor smirked. Kane wasn't concerned for himself, but he had seen this dynamic before. Bullies didn't target the strong first, they targeted the vulnerable. A loud commotion broke Kane's train of thought. Across the deck, Razor had shifted his attention to a middle-aged couple sitting quietly at a corner table. The man was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, clearly on vacation with his wife, and visibly uncomfortable with the attention Razor was directing his way. Razor stood, towering over the table, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, buddy, nice shirt. What's the occasion? Retirement from working a desk job?" The man forced a polite smile, but Kane could see the nervous tension in his eyes. His wife reached out, clutching his arm, whispering something. "Come on, don't be shy. Show everyone how tough you are," Razor continued, leaning closer, his voice louder. "Or did you let her pick your clothes for you, too?" Laughter echoed from the other bikers. Kane felt the heat rise in his chest. His training was urging him to move, to intervene. But restraint was critical. If he stepped in now, Razor would twist the situation, make it look like Kane was the aggressor. That wasn't how this needed to play out. The couple tried to leave, but Razor blocked their path with a casual step. "Where you going? We're just getting started," Razor sneered, crossing his arms. Kane exhaled slowly and stood, keeping his movements controlled. He approached with measured steps, his voice calm but cutting through the noise with clarity. "That's enough." Razor turned, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Oh, look who decided to join us. The hero." Kane didn't rise to the bait. His eyes stayed on Razor, unblinking, unwavering. "You've had your fun. Let them leave. Razor stepped closer, the scent of alcohol sharp on his breath. His voice dropped to a threatening whisper. You got a problem, Marine? 'Cause I'd be happy to help you find one. Kane's voice remained low, steady. You're embarrassing yourself. Walk away. For a moment, the tension was so thick it felt like the entire deck had gone silent. The couple hurried past Razor as he stared Kane down, jaw tight, knuckles flexing. But Kane didn't move. He didn't need to. Razor's lip curled into a sneer, but he took a step back, laughing bitterly. Fine. You want to play the good guy? Be my guest. This ain't over. The bikers retreated, but Kane knew it wasn't a surrender. It was a warning. Later that night, as the ship's entertainment events kicked off, Kane returned to his cabin to find a disturbing message waiting. The mirror above the sink had been defaced with a thick marker. No heroes here. Kane stared at the words for a long moment, expression unreadable. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't afraid. But the game was shifting, and Razor had just crossed another line. Kane had been patient. But now the storm was building, and if Razor wanted a fight, Kane was more than ready. The ship's casino buzzed with activity, the soft clinking of chips and shuffling of cards mingling with the distant hum of the engines. Elegant lighting reflected off polished mahogany tables as tourists gathered for a night of harmless fun, at least for most. Kane rarely gambled, but tonight he wasn't here for the thrill of winning. He was watching, observing. He had learned long ago that people revealed their true nature when money and ego were involved. And tonight, Razor was playing both games. Razor and his crew occupied the largest poker table near the center of the casino, their loud voices cutting through the subdued atmosphere. Razor, in particular, seemed to revel in the attention, tossing chips carelessly and taunting the dealer with every move. Kane remained in the background, leaning against a pillar near the bar, unnoticed, for now. But he saw the way Razor's eyes scanned the room periodically, looking for him, searching for his next move. It didn't take long for Razor to spot him. The moment their eyes met across the crowded floor, Razor grinned and beckoned Kane over with a curling finger. Hey, Marine, you gonna stand there all night or you gonna play like a man? The bait was obvious. Kane had faced psychological warfare before. Razor wasn't testing skill, he was testing control, and Kane wasn't about to walk away. He approached the table calmly, sliding into the seat directly across from Razor without a word. The other bikers snickered, but Kane remained stone-faced, his focus only on the cards. The dealer shuffled and the game began. The first few rounds were quiet, almost uneventful. Kane folded early, watching the patterns. Razor played aggressively, too aggressively, trying to dominate with bold bets and loud jokes. Kane read him easily. Razor wasn't as skilled as he thought. But then the stakes changed. Razor pushed a large stack of chips forward, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. What do you say, Marine? Show us that discipline you keep bragging about. Kane said nothing. He met Razor's stare and matched the bet. The dealer revealed the cards. Kane had a solid hand, 2 pair, but Razor had a straight flush. He leaned forward with exaggerated flair, sweeping the chips toward his side. Oh, would you look at that? Guess all those combat skills don't help with luck, huh? Razor sneered, the bikers laughing behind him. Kane remained expressionless, studying the cards more closely. Something was off. Razor's last win had been too perfect, too precise. His instincts told him there was more than luck in play. The next hand was dealt. This time, Kane stayed calm, his mind working through possibilities. He bet modestly, watching how Razor interacted with the dealer, the subtle hand gestures exchanged under the table. Cheating, confirmed. Kane exhaled slowly, pushing his chips forward once again. But this time, when Razor raised the stakes to an outrageous level, Kane called without hesitation. The cards flipped. Kane had a full house. Razor held a suspiciously perfect 4 of a kind. Razor leaned back, arms wide in victory. "Man, you really should stick to push-ups and drills, Marine." But Kane didn't flinch. He spoke calmly but loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Or maybe you should stop signaling the dealer for cards." Silence dropped over the table. Razor's grin faltered. "What did you say?" Kane folded his arms. "You heard me. You've been cheating since I sat down, tapping your ring twice for a card switch. You're not even subtle about it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The dealer turned pale and Razor's jaw tightened. "You calling me a liar?" Razor snarled, pushing back his chair and rising to his full height. Kane stood too, calm, measured. "No, I'm calling you a cheater." For a heartbeat, it seemed like Razor would lunge, fists clenching at his sides. But Kane didn't move. His eyes were cold steel, unwavering. Security arrived moments later, drawn by the tension. Kane didn't even need to explain. Witnesses backed his claim, and the dealer, visibly shaken, confirmed Razor's signals under pressure. Razor's winnings were confiscated, his reputation bruised. But as Kane turned to leave, Razor hissed under his breath, "This ain't over, Marine." Kane didn't look back. No, it wasn't over, and Razor was about to learn just how far he had overstepped. The ship drifted peacefully under a starless sky, the waves gently lapping against its sides. The hum of the engines was barely audible above the faint sound of music from the deck parties above. But inside Kane's cabin, there was nothing peaceful. A low knock echoed from his door. Kane set down his book, already knowing who it would be. He opened the door to find not just one, but 3 members of the Hell's Serpents standing in the dimly lit hallway. Razor wasn't there, but Tank, the broad, heavy-set biker with a scar running down his cheek, filled the doorway. "Evening, Marine." Tank's voice was low and mocking, a forced calm masking the tension beneath. Kane said nothing. His eyes shifted, quietly cataloging the positioning. 2 others flanked Tank, one standing slightly behind, the other closer to the stairwell exit. Intimidation tactics. Classic. Surround and corner. Tank continued. "We don't like how you made our boss look back there. Real disrespectful, calling him a cheat in front of all those people." Kane's expression didn't change. He was cheating. Tank's grin faded. He took a step closer, leaning into Kane's personal space. "You think you're untouchable just 'cause you got a couple medals and some pretty words from Uncle Sam? This ain't the Marines, hero. Out here it's different." Kane met his gaze, voice steady. "You're right, it is different. Because on this ship, there are witnesses, cameras, security. I'm guessing none of you want to get detained before we even hit international waters. So why don't you take your little message and walk away?" Tank's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. Instead, he reached into his leather vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper, pressing it hard against Kane's chest. "Read it. We're just getting started." Kane took the note, never breaking eye contact. When Tank finally turned to leave, his 2 companions following closely, Kane shut the door and unfolded the paper. "You won't make it off this ship in one piece." Kane stared at the words for a long moment. They weren't threats. They were promises. But Kane wasn't the kind of man to be rattled by words. The next morning, the ship's atmosphere felt lighter on the surface. Families laughed by the pool. Waitstaff served tropical drinks with bright umbrellas. Couples danced during the brunch show. But Kane could sense it. Tension bubbling just beneath the surface, invisible to most, but undeniable to him. Razor and his crew had taken over a section of the lounge again, their voices louder than the music playing through the speakers. The staff kept their distance, eyes down, avoiding conflict. Kane sat alone near the balcony, keeping his back against the railing as he observed. Razor wasn't smiling today. His eyes were darker, more calculating. Every so often he'd glance toward Kane's direction, subtle but unmistakable. A waitress approached Kane's table cautiously, setting down a glass of water. She lingered for a second longer than necessary, her voice a whisper. "They said you should watch your back tonight." Kane's gaze shifted to her. She was young, early 20s, clearly frightened. "Who said that?" She glanced nervously at the bikers before shaking her head and leaving without another word. Kane exhaled slowly, controlling the rising heat in his chest. This was more than a game now. Razor was testing limits, seeing how far he could push before Kane snapped. But snapping was never Kane's style. He didn't operate on impulse, he operated on precision. That night, as the ship settled into a quieter rhythm, Kane sat alone on the observation deck under the pale moonlight. The stars were veiled behind clouds, the ocean an endless expanse of black stretching in every direction. The Hell's Serpents weren't finished with him, but when they made their next move, they wouldn't be ready for how Kane would respond, because the next time they came knocking, he wasn't just going to block the door, he was going to shut it, for good. The night air was thick with salt and silence, the vast ocean stretching endlessly under a dark sky. The ship's lights reflected faintly off the rolling waves, a peaceful illusion masking the tension Kane felt building with every passing hour. Razor and his crew had crossed the line. Threats were one thing. Invading his space and testing his restraint? That was another. But Kane wasn't angry. He was preparing. Years of military training had forged his mind for moments exactly like this, when trouble brewed just beneath the surface and the key wasn't reacting, but anticipating. Razor expected a brawl, a display of dominance, fists flying, and public humiliation. But Kane knew better. This wasn't a battlefield, this was strategy, and Razor had already made critical mistakes. Sitting on his cabin floor, Kane unfolded a napkin on which he had carefully drawn the ship's deck layout from memory. His mind processed every detail with precision. He had already memorized the placement of security cameras, the guard rotation schedules, and the blind spots where Razor's men seemed to congregate. There was a pattern to their behavior. Reckless, yes, but predictable. The next step was neutralizing the threat without violence. Yet. A soft knock at the door broke his focus. Kane opened it cautiously, finding the same young waitress from earlier, clutching a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she extended it toward him. "They told me to give you this," she whispered, her eyes glancing nervously down the hall. Kane took the note and unfolded it. "Midnight, lower deck B. Come alone if you're man enough." Kane's jaw tightened. Razor was escalating, trying to corner him in a place where no cameras would catch the outcome. But the real mistake? Razor thought he was controlling the situation. "Thank you," Kane said softly, handing the note back. "What's your name?" "Lisa." "Lisa, you don't need to be afraid of these men. If anything happens, you come straight to the ship's captain or security. Understand?" She nodded, but hesitated before leaving. "They're not just messing with you anymore. Be careful." Kane gave her a firm nod and closed the door. 11:55 p.m. Lower Deck B. The ship's lower decks were silent, a stark contrast to the music still playing far above where the passengers danced without a care. Here the air felt colder, damp with sea spray leaking through the vents. The rhythmic pulse of the engines echoed through the metal walls like a heartbeat. Kane arrived early. Razor wanted control. He wanted Kane to feel hunted. But Kane was already in position, pressed against the shadows, observing. The bikers emerged in staggered steps. First Razor, then Tank, followed by two others from the poker game. No surprise ambush, no weapons drawn, just flexing their numbers, puffing out their chests. Razor smirked, arms crossed as he approached. "Look who showed up. Told you he'd come running." Kane stayed silent. He let Razor talk. Men like him thrived on hearing their own voice. "You got this whole tough guy act going, Marine," Razor continued, stepping closer. "But out here, you're not in uniform. You're just another passenger, so maybe it's time you learned where you stand." Kane's voice remained calm, measured. "And where exactly is that, Razor?" Razor's eyes narrowed. "Right under my boot." The other bikers shifted, muscles tensing as if ready for a fight, but Kane didn't flinch. He had seen true violence, chaos where lives hung in the balance. This was theater. Razor was posturing, hoping Kane would lash out first. Kane spoke softly, words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've made 3 mistakes tonight." Razor blinked, his smirk faltering. "What?" "First," Kane interrupted, taking a slow step forward, "you threatened an innocent couple. Second, you involved crew members in your intimidation tactics. And third," his voice dropped lower, quieter, "you called the wrong man out." The silence was deafening. Razor's smirk twisted into a scowl. "You think you're some kind of hero? I got a dozen guys ready to—" Kane stepped forward, closing the gap completely. His voice barely a whisper but charged with unshakable authority. "No, Razor. You have a dozen cowards following you because they're too scared to think for themselves. You've lost control, and you know it." The tension cracked. Razor's fist shot forward in a sudden lunge, sloppy, emotional, predictable. Kane shifted effortlessly, sidestepping and locking Razor's wrist in a tight hold. He applied just enough pressure to force Razor to his knees with a grunt of pain. The other bikers flinched but didn't move. They saw it. Kane hadn't attacked. He had defended, controlled, precise. "Walk away now, Razor," Kane whispered, "because next time I won't be this forgiving." He released Razor with a firm shove backward. Razor stumbled, humiliated, his face flushed with fury. But he didn't strike again. Not this time. Kane didn't stay to gloat. He turned and walked away, knowing the message had been sent. But deep down, he also knew this was far from over. Razor wasn't the kind of man to let humiliation settle. And next time, he wouldn't come without a plan. The sun hung low over the vast horizon, casting golden streaks across the ocean as the cruise ship sailed steadily forward. On the surface, the voyage remained a paradise. Laughter echoing from the pool, couples swaying gently to the soft music drifting from the lounge. But beneath the surface, Kane knew the atmosphere was changing. Razor was spiraling. After their midnight confrontation, the Hell's Serpents had gone quiet. Too quiet. Kane knew from experience that when bullies stopped making noise, they were plotting. Razor had tasted humiliation, and men like him didn't forgive. It festered, boiling beneath the surface until it exploded. Kane sat at a quiet corner of the ship's observation deck, sipping coffee as he watched the crowd. Razor hadn't shown himself all morning, but his crew lingered, scattered in pairs, eyeing Kane from a distance. Waiting, calculating. But Kane wasn't concerned for himself. He was concerned for the passengers caught in the crossfire. It wasn't long before Razor made his next move. A loud crash from the dining hall snapped Kane's attention. He was on his feet instantly, moving toward the sound as concerned passengers whispered and pointed. At the center of the disturbance stood Razor, breathing heavily, face flushed with fury. Plates lay shattered around him, a toppled dessert cart smeared across the floor. Kane didn't need to ask what had happened. A young waiter stood frozen, hands trembling, face pale as Razor loomed over him. "You think it's funny? Dropping food on my boots?" Razor bellowed, his voice echoing through the hall. "You better clean this up before I—" "That's enough." Kane's voice cut through the chaos, steady and sharp. Razor's head snapped around, eyes narrowing as he saw Kane approaching. The other passengers fell silent, tension thick enough to be felt in the air. "Back for more, huh?" Razor sneered, gesturing at the mess on the floor. "Stay out of this, Marine. It's between me and him." Kane shook his head. "No, it's between you and your own anger. Walk away now, Razor, before this gets worse." Razor's lip curled, but Kane noticed the hesitation, the fear. "You're afraid," Kane said quietly, stepping closer, his voice calm but cutting. "Not of me, of losing control, of looking weak in front of them." He gestured subtly toward the watching crowd and Razor's own men. Razor's eyes flicked around, noticing how the bikers behind him weren't laughing this time. They were silent, watching, judging. "Do it," Kane whispered. "Take the swing. Prove me right." Razor's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ground audibly. His fists trembled, knuckles white with tension. But he didn't swing. Not this time. Instead, he shoved the waiter aside and stormed out, leaving the mess behind. The tension slowly dissolved, passengers returning to their meals with hushed whispers. But Kane knew what had just happened. Razor hadn't walked away out of wisdom. He was losing control, and that made him even more dangerous. And Kane was certain the next attack wouldn't come as a confrontation. It would be an ambush. The night was calm, the ship drifting through the open sea under a blanket of stars. The distant sound of waves lapping against the hull echoed faintly through the corridors, but Kane's instincts told him tonight wouldn't stay peaceful for long. He felt it in the air, like the silent tension before a storm. The day had passed without another incident from Razor. Kane hadn't seen the Hell's Serpents since the mess in the dining hall, but their absence only confirmed his suspicions. Razor wasn't done. He was regrouping, waiting for the right moment to strike back. And tonight felt like that moment. Kane had returned to his cabin late, the quiet hum of the ship's engines filling the space. But something felt off. It wasn't the room itself. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. No threats scrawled on mirrors, no tampered belongings. But Kane wasn't fooled by the silence. His instincts were proven right when a faint scratching sound echoed from outside his cabin door. Not footsteps, not staff, something intentional. He moved silently, positioning himself beside the door instead of facing it directly. Years of combat had taught him that the element of surprise was everything. The scraping grew louder, then stopped. Suddenly, the door handle turned. It was slow, controlled. Someone trying to be quiet. The latch clicked open. Before the door could swing fully, Kane acted. He yanked the door inward, catching the first figure completely off guard. Tank. The heavy-set biker stumbled into the room, thrown off balance. Kane moved like a machine, fluid and precise. He twisted Tank's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees in a single smooth motion. The second biker, one of the younger recruits, rushed in behind, wielding a glass bottle as a makeshift weapon. Kane deflected with a sharp elbow, shattering the bottle against the wall. "Stop," Kane ordered, his voice low and commanding. Tank grunted, struggling but unable to break Kane's grip. The younger biker hesitated, backing toward the door as Razor finally stepped into view from the hallway. The gang leader's face twisted into a grin as he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Nice reflexes, Marine. Let him go. This doesn't have to get messy." Kane released Tank, who fell forward gasping, clutching his wrist. Kane remained calm, stepping between the bikers and the door. "You sent them to break into my cabin? That your play now, Razor?" Kane's voice was steady but edged with quiet anger. Razor shrugged. "Just a little reminder. You embarrassed me, made me look weak. I can't let that slide. Thought you get the message." Kane shook his head, eyes narrowing. "You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't a game. You've threatened passengers, crew members. You're done here, Razor." Razor's grin widened. "You can't do anything, Marine. Ship security won't believe you. No proof. Just words. But I'll tell you what. Walk away. Quit the tough guy act. And maybe this all ends here." Kane stared at him for a long moment. Then he took a slow step closer, voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I've let you walk away twice now. Once in the casino, once in the dining hall. I won't let you take a third shot." Razor's grin faltered for just a second. "This ends tonight," Kane finished. or it ends when the captain throws you and your crew off this ship." Razor's face hardened. "You just made a big mistake." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the hallway, his men following behind. Kane exhaled slowly, the tension lingering like a ghost in the room. He knew what came next. Razor wasn't done. He was just getting desperate. And when desperate men made their final move, Kane would be ready. The morning sun cast shimmering streaks across the ocean, but there was nothing peaceful about the tension that had settled over the ship. The confrontation the night before had left a mark, not just on Kane, but on the entire dynamic Razor had carefully built with his crew. Kane could feel it shifting. It wasn't just Razor watching him anymore. The other bikers, the ones who had laughed during the earlier confrontations, were quieter now, less defiant, less confident. Razor had shown weakness, and it had rippled through his ranks. But Kane knew better than to think it was over. Razor wasn't the kind of man who accepted cracks in his authority. He was going to reassert control, and that meant crossing lines he hadn't dared cross yet. It started at the breakfast buffet. Kane was seated alone, the scent of fresh coffee lingering as the ship's guests moved about the dining hall. Music played softly in the background, blending with the chatter of families enjoying their morning. But Kane's focus narrowed when he saw Razor enter. He wasn't alone. 3 serpents trailed behind him, but there was something different now. Razor wasn't loud. He wasn't posturing. His expression was sharp, focused, calculated. Kane watched as Razor approached a nearby table where the young couple from earlier was seated, the same family he'd defended when this all began. The husband noticed Razor approaching, his body stiffening. His wife squeezed his hand, already uneasy. Razor leaned down toward their table, speaking softly enough that no one else but them could hear. Kane couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He saw the way the man paled, his shoulders tightening as his wife whispered something hurriedly. A threat. Kane was on his feet before he even realized it. "Leave them alone." His voice was calm, but loud enough to halt conversation across half the dining area. Heads turned. Conversations fell quiet. The bikers flinched as all eyes shifted toward them. Razor straightened slowly, the grin on his face dripping with mock innocence. "What, Marine? Can't a guy have a friendly chat over breakfast?" Kane's stare didn't waver. "They're not part of this. You want me? Fine. But you leave them out of it." Razor took a slow step forward, close enough that Kane could smell the lingering alcohol on his breath. His voice dropped low, venomous. "You think you're in control here? This ain't the battlefield, hero. No rank to hide behind, no backup. Just you. And when this ship docks, there won't be cameras. There won't be witnesses." Kane didn't blink. "You already lost control, Razor. Your own men see it. And you're losing more every time you pull stunts like this." The words hit their mark. Kane could see it in the slight twitch of Razor's jaw, the tension in his fists. But Razor wasn't ready to admit defeat. Instead, he smirked. "Yeah? Let's see how tough you are when you're all alone, Marine." With that, Razor turned sharply and left the dining area, his men trailing behind in silence. But Kane noticed something Razor didn't. The other bikers, the younger ones, were glancing back. Not with loyalty, not with admiration, but with doubt. Razor had broken a code today. Threatening the innocent wasn't just weak, it was disgraceful, and it was only a matter of time before his empire crumbled entirely. But Kane knew Razor's next move would be even more dangerous. A man losing power was the most unpredictable threat of all. The sun dipped lower over the horizon, streaking the sky with fiery shades of orange and deep purple as the cruise ship continued its slow journey across the open sea. On the surface, the evening was calm, passengers laughing, enjoying cocktails, lost in the illusion of luxury and peace. But Kane felt it, the shift. Razor was losing his grip and the cracks in his authority were widening, but instead of retreating, Razor was doubling down. Kane had seen this behavior before. reckless men who clung to power through desperation, becoming more dangerous with every failure. Tonight, Kane wasn't going to wait for Razor's next move. He was going to control the board before Razor had a chance to strike again. Kane stood on the observation deck, the cool wind brushing against his face. His mind was sharp, focused, replaying every detail from the last few days. Razor's patterns had become clear: loud distractions, public displays of dominance, but no true skill. Kane's approach, however, was different. He didn't just react, he calculated. In his hand, he held a folded piece of paper, the ship's floor plan, marked with observations he'd made since boarding. Blind spots in the security cameras, staff rotations, key areas where confrontation could be avoided or where it could be controlled. The next phase was simple: eliminate Razor's ability to strike without consequences. Step 1. Isolate the crew. Kane waited until Razor's gang had gathered on the portside lounge, drinking and boasting as usual. Without confrontation, he quietly approached Officer Daniels, the ship's head of security. "Daniels," Kane said, voice calm but serious, "we need to talk." Daniels looked wary. "Mr. Kane, if this is about the dining incident earlier—" Kane shook his head. "This is about preventing the next one. I need you to quietly watch the group at table 7. Notice their behavior. Notice how the passengers near them are uncomfortable." Daniels frowned but followed Kane's gaze. Razor and his men were indeed disrupting nearby tables. Obnoxious laughter, slamming drinks, and rude remarks. It wasn't physical. Yet. Kane continued. "They've already threatened multiple passengers. One verbal, one physical. And they're testing boundaries. I'm giving you a chance to control this before it escalates further." Daniels nodded slowly. "I'll keep them under surveillance, but no direct action unless they will," Kane said firmly. "You'll know when." Step 2. Remove the bystanders. Kane took matters into his own hands next. He approached several waitstaff discreetly, giving quiet instructions to steer families and couples away from the area. "Hey," he told a waiter with a full tray, "start moving the larger parties toward the other side of the deck. Tell them the view is better. Don't mention the bikers, just shift the crowd." The waiter, sensing Kane's authority, nodded without question. Slowly, the deck cleared. Razor didn't notice. His focus was still on maintaining his tough image. Step 3. Psychological tactics. Kane approached the table slowly, his presence controlled, powerful without aggression. The chatter dropped as Razor noticed him, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "Look who's back. Thought you'd finally learn to mind your own business, Marine?" Kane didn't respond to the words. Instead, he let the silence hang. Razor's men exchanged glances, unsure. "You've made yourself loud enough, Razor," Kane said quietly, keeping his voice calm. "But the thing about loud men, they're the easiest to track, to control." Razor blinked, caught off guard. Kane leaned in just slightly. "You see, I don't need to raise my voice, because I already have control over this situation. You've made mistakes. You're losing their respect." Kane nodded toward his crew. "And deep down, you know it." Razor shot up from his chair, fist tightening. "You trying to play mind games with me, Marine?" Kane's eyes didn't move from his. "I don't play games. I finish them." The silence was deafening. Razor's men shifted uncomfortably, some backing away. Daniels, now watching closely from the security station, had seen enough. He spoke into his radio. "Captain, we may have an escalating situation on the lounge deck. I'm moving in now." But Kane knew the fight was already over. Razor wasn't the threat he pretended to be. His gang had seen it. The balance of power had shifted. And Razor knew it too. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the railings, calm and infinite, but the tension on board was anything but peaceful. The confrontation on the lounge deck had left Razor humiliated. His men were no longer hanging on his every word. The cracks in his control had spread wide, and Kane knew it. But humiliation wasn't the same as defeat. Razor was dangerous now, more dangerous than when he was in control. Desperation had a way of driving men to extremes, and Kane had learned long ago that broken pride often bred reckless actions. Tonight, Kane wasn't just waiting for Razor to strike. He was going to dismantle him completely, by exposing the weakness that had been driving this conflict all along. The ship's lower deck was nearly deserted that evening, most passengers drawn to the formal dinner and live music events on the upper floors. Kane, however, preferred the quiet. Solitude allowed clarity, planning, control. But tonight, the solitude was interrupted. A figure emerged from the shadows near the deck's edge, Tank. The heavy-set biker approached slowly, his broad frame tense but lacking the same aggressive confidence from earlier encounters. His scarred face was set in a grim expression, his hands tucked deep into his vest pockets. Kane remained calm, leaning against the railing as Tank stopped a few feet away. "You following me now, Tank? Or did Razor send you again?" Tank shook his head. His voice was quieter than Kane expected. "I ain't here to start trouble, Marine. I gotta say something." Kane raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, letting him speak. Tank exhaled, glancing toward the dark waters. "Look, Razor, he's not a bad guy. Not really, just messed up. Always has been." Kane folded his arms. "Go on." Tank hesitated, then finally continued. "You know why he acts like this? Like he's got something to prove? It ain't just the gang. It's personal." Kane's instincts sharpened. This was the opening he needed. Tank's voice lowered. "He wasn't always like this. A long time ago, back when we were just kids, Razor was different. Tough, yeah, but not mean. His old man. That's where it started. The guy was a nightmare. Beat him down. Told him he'd never be a man. Said he was weak." The words hung heavily in the salty air. "So Razor learned to act tough, to dominate, to control. 'Cause he's scared, Kane. Always has been." Kane nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. Razor wasn't just lashing out for power. He was masking fear, deep, unresolved pain he'd never confronted. But fear like that didn't just fade. It festered. Tank continued, voice heavier now. "I ain't saying you should let him off the hook, but you should know what you're dealing with. He ain't gonna stop until you break him, or he breaks himself." Kane's jaw tightened. He understood now. Razor's anger wasn't personal. It was survival. A fragile ego held together by violence and control. And men like that didn't stop. They either destroyed themselves or someone else. Later that night, Kane found himself standing at the ship's gym, empty after hours. He wasn't there to train. He was waiting. The door opened and Razor entered alone. No crew, no gang. Just the man himself. Kane didn't speak. He simply stood there, arms folded, waiting. Razor's face twisted into a scowl, but Kane saw past it now. The anger, the tension, the fear. "This ends now, Razor," Kane said firmly. "Walk away before you do something you can't take back." Razor sneered, but it was weaker now, forced. "You think you know me? Think you're better than me?" Kane shook his head. "No, I'm not better. I've just made peace with who I am. You're still running from your father's voice." Razor's face drained of color, the words hitting deeper than any punch could have. His fists clenched, but he didn't move. The truth was out. Kane hadn't broken him with violence. He'd broken him with the truth. And now, Razor had a choice. But Kane knew. This wasn't over yet. The next move was Razor's, and it would be the most dangerous one yet. The next morning, the sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Kane found himself back on the observation deck, sipping a cup of bitter black coffee as the wind tugged at his shirt. The tension that had built over the past few days wasn't gone. It was sharper now, more concentrated. Razor was unraveling, and Kane could feel it. It wasn't just in the silence of the bikers who had retreated from their usual loud antics. It was in Razor's absence. He hadn't shown himself since their confrontation in the gym, and that wasn't a sign of surrender. It was the calm before the storm. Kane didn't have to wait long to be proven right. The ship's head of security, Officer Daniels, appeared from the glass doors leading onto the deck. His face was tight, professional, but there was an undercurrent of tension behind his usual calm demeanor. "Mr. Kane," Daniels began, voice clipped. "A word, please." Kane set his coffee down. "I'm listening." Daniels gestured for privacy, moving toward a quieter corner of the deck. "We've had complaints from a guest." Kane raised an eyebrow. "Razor?" Daniels nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "He claims you've been harassing his group, accusing them of criminal behavior, threatening them." Kane exhaled slowly, not surprised, but disappointed. Razor had taken the coward's route, weaponizing the system instead of facing him directly. "And you believe him?" Kane asked evenly. Daniels hesitated. "No, but policy requires me to investigate formal complaints. Razor is saying you've been the aggressor since the poker game incident. He's demanding you be restricted from certain areas of the ship." Kane shook his head, jaw tightening. "You and I both know that's not how it happened. He's manipulating the situation because he knows he's losing control." Daniels nodded, but his professionalism held firm. "I do know that. But if he continues pressing, it will be out of my hands. Look, I don't want this to escalate further. We're out in open water. Things need to stay calm. You're a Marine. You understand the importance of de-escalation." Kane nodded slowly. "I do, but Razor's not playing by the same rules." Daniels frowned, lowering his voice. "Is he planning something?" Kane's gaze drifted toward the pool deck below, where he spotted Razor sitting alone now, not with his usual pack of followers. His posture was different, rigid, controlled, the look of a man calculating his next move. "He's testing boundaries. That complaint was just the opening move," Kane said quietly. "He's not finished." Daniels exhaled, clearly troubled. "I'll keep security tightened, but I need you to stay out of his way. If anything happens, come to me first." Kane nodded, but they both knew the truth. Razor wasn't going to stop until he felt like he had regained control, and Kane wasn't the type to back down from men like him. Later that night, gala event. The ship's grand ballroom glittered with elegance, chandeliers casting soft golden hues across polished marble floors, guests dressed in formal attire, and a live string quartet playing softly in the corner. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, an elegant gala for the passengers to unwind. But Kane wasn't here to celebrate. He watched from the edge of the room, keeping to the shadows, his eyes scanning the crowd. Razor was there, lingering near the bar with only 2 of his men. Kane noticed the difference immediately. Razor's crew wasn't flanking him like before. There was space, distance. Control was slipping further. Razor's gaze locked with Kane's, his face twisted in a slow, venomous smirk. Then, in a move designed purely for spectacle, Razor raised his glass in a mock toast across the room. Kane didn't respond. But Razor wasn't done. He turned back toward the bar where a young waiter was passing by, balancing a tray of champagne flutes. With a deliberate motion, Razor accidentally knocked the entire tray from the waiter's hands, glass shattering loudly as champagne sprayed across the floor. The music stopped. Conversations died. The waiter stammered apologies, kneeling to gather the broken shards. Razor spread his arms wide, smirking. "Ah, come on. It's just a drink. You gonna cry about it?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People exchanged uncomfortable glances. Kane had seen enough. Without a word, he crossed the room, his boots echoing in the now quiet ballroom. He didn't speak until he was standing directly in front of Razor, voice calm but carrying authority. "Apologize?" Razor scoffed. "For what? Teaching this kid to watch where he's going?" Kane didn't blink. "Apologize. Now." The room was silent. Eyes were on them. Razor's crew didn't move. The guests whispered. Even the captain had stepped to the edge of the room, watching closely. Razor's face twisted, caught between defiance and the humiliation of the crowd's attention. He opened his mouth. "Enough." Officer Daniels had arrived, stepping between them. His face was stone cold as he addressed Razor. "Mr. Kane, step back. Mr. Razor, you're coming with me." Razor's face burned with rage. "This is ridiculous. He's the one—" Daniels cut him off sharply. "You've made enough of a spectacle. Come with me now." Kane held Razor's gaze as Daniels escorted him from the room. Razor's face was a storm of anger and wounded pride. Kane knew exactly what was happening. Razor was no longer in control. And the next time they crossed paths, it wouldn't be words Razor used to settle the score. It would be violence. The ocean whispered softly against the hull of the ship, the rhythmic pulse of waves blending with the distant sound of music from the ballroom far above. But on the top deck, beneath the pale light of the moon, the air was anything but peaceful. Kane stood alone near the railing, gazing out at the endless black horizon. He wasn't reflecting. He wasn't searching for calm. He was waiting. Razor had been humiliated in front of everyone at the gala. His pride had been wounded, and Kane knew there was only one way Razor would respond now. Not with words, not with petty threats, with force. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell behind him, steady, purposeful. Kane didn't turn immediately. He didn't have to. "I knew you couldn't stay away," he said, voice calm. Razor emerged from the shadows, his face partially lit by the pale glow of the deck lights. His expression was twisted with barely contained rage, his jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. But this time, he was alone. No gang, no audience. Just the confrontation Razor had been building toward since the moment Kane had first defied him. "You think you humiliated me, Marine?" Razor's voice was low, venomous. "You think you're better than me? All this talk, all this posturing, but you're just a man, flesh and bone, and I'm about to remind you of that." Kane finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable, controlled. He saw the anger, the need for control, but behind it he saw what Tank had revealed: wounded pride, desperation, fear. "I'm not here to fight you, Razor," Kane said, voice steady. "I'm giving you a chance to stop this before you make a mistake you can't undo." Razor's lip curled into a sneer. "Stop? You took my pride from me in front of my men. You think I can just walk away from that? Nah, Marine. We settle this tonight. Just you and me." Kane shook his head slowly. "No, Razor. It was never about me. It's about you, and you know it." The words cut deeper than Razor expected. His fists clenched tighter, his breathing ragged. For a split second, Kane thought there might be a crack in the rage, a moment of clarity. But Razor wasn't ready for clarity. He lunged. The swing was wild, driven by anger, not skill. Kane sidestepped effortlessly, deflecting Razor's arm with a controlled motion, redirecting his momentum so Razor stumbled forward. "Stop!" Kane warned again. Razor roared in frustration, spinning with another punch, sloppier this time. Kane intercepted, catching Razor's wrist and twisting just enough to lock the joint, forcing Razor to drop to his knees with a pained grunt. "This isn't strength, Razor," Kane said, voice low but commanding. "This is desperation." Razor snarled, yanking his arm free and staggering back to his feet. His eyes were wild now, filled with more shame than anger. "You think you're some righteous hero? You're just like the rest of them, always looking down on me." Kane didn't move. He could see it, the final unraveling. "I'm not your enemy," Kane said, voice steady but firm. But you need to stop. Walk away, Razor, while you still can." Razor hesitated, his chest heaving. The fight was leaving him. The anger was burning out, replaced with something else, exhaustion. But then a voice echoed from the shadows. "Razor, you good?" Tank. He had appeared at the top of the stairwell, watching with a conflicted expression. Behind him, two more of the serpents lingered, uncertainty on their faces. Razor stiffened, his pride flaring back to life as he realized they had seen everything. The humiliation, the defeat. And that was his breaking point. With a guttural yell, Razor charged again, but this time Kane was done being merciful. He pivoted sharply, catching Razor mid-charge, twisting his body and dropping him face first onto the deck in a controlled takedown. Razor hit hard. The wind knocked from his lungs as Kane restrained him with minimal effort, pinning his wrist behind his back. The serpents didn't intervene. They just watched. Kane leaned in close, voice cold and final. "This ends now. Do you hear me? No more threats, no more violence. If you ever target another innocent person on this ship again." He applied just enough pressure to make Razor grunt in pain. "You won't walk away this time." For the first time, Razor didn't resist. His body sagged, the fight finally leaving him. Kane released him and stood, stepping back. Razor stayed on the deck, gasping for air, his face a mixture of rage and humiliation, but no defiance. The serpents remained silent. Tank finally spoke, his voice low. "Come on, Razor, let's go." Razor didn't argue. He staggered to his feet, not even making eye contact with Kane as he turned and followed his crew back toward the stairwell. But Kane knew this wasn't over completely. A man like Razor didn't forget humiliation. But he had learned something tonight. Kane wasn't a man to be trifled with. And next time, Razor would think twice before picking the wrong fight again. The next morning, the cruise ship glided smoothly across calm waters, but the atmosphere on board felt noticeably different. The tension that had simmered over the past few days was beginning to shift, no longer fueled by fear, but by something else. Whispers, stories, rumors. Passengers had seen what happened on the top deck. Word spread quickly in a confined space like this. Kane's confrontation with Razor had turned into ship-wide gossip, transforming from a clash between two men into a legend retold with each passing conversation. "Did you hear about the Marine who took down that biker leader last night?" "I saw it. He didn't even break a sweat, just dropped him like a sack of potatoes." "It was self-defense, I think. The biker came at him first. That Marine barely had to do anything. Total control." Kane could hear the hushed voices as he passed through the breakfast lounge. People didn't speak directly to him, but they didn't need to. Their eyes said enough. Curious, impressed, even a little wary. This was exactly what Razor feared most, losing the illusion of dominance. Kane sat alone at a corner table, stirring his coffee in quiet contemplation. He hadn't come on this cruise to be the center of attention. He had come for peace, solitude. But men like Razor thrived on fear and spectacle, and Kane knew he had become a symbol Razor couldn't afford to let stand. As if on cue, Tank appeared at the edge of the dining area. This time, no threats, no hostility. He approached cautiously, arms crossed but not in a defensive way, more thoughtful, conflicted. "Mind if I sit?" Tank asked, his voice low. Kane gestured to the empty seat. The big man sat heavily, fingers drumming on the table for a moment before speaking. "I heard what people are saying," he began, glancing around. "They're talking like you're some kind of hero. Not sure if you meant for that to happen, but Razor ain't taking it well." Kane nodded slightly. "I didn't mean for any of this, but he forced the situation." Tank exhaled, leaning closer. "Look, I know you're not afraid of him. Hell, everyone knows now. But I'm telling you, this ain't over for him. Razor's not wired to let things slide, especially with the way you made him look." Kane studied Tank carefully. "And what about you? You planning to follow him over the edge when he makes his next mistake?" Tank hesitated. His jaw tightened. "I ain't like him," he muttered. "I ride with the serpents, yeah, but I never signed up for this intimidation crap. It was supposed to be about loyalty, brotherhood." Kane nodded slowly. "Loyalty is earned, and if you're questioning his leadership now, maybe it's because you're seeing the cracks for what they are." Tank remained silent, his gaze shifting toward the floor. Finally, he spoke again, quieter this time. "I just don't want anyone getting hurt. I came on this trip to unwind, not this." Kane leaned back, his voice calm but deliberate. "Then make a choice, Tank. Walk away before Razor drags you further into this. No one's making you stay loyal to a sinking ship." Tank gave a reluctant nod, rising from his chair. Before he left, he turned back. "I'll keep an eye on him, but be ready. Razor won't stay quiet long." Later that day, deckside bar. The tension had shifted, but not entirely dissolved. Razor sat alone at the far end of the bar, sunglasses hiding the bruise swelling along his cheekbone from their last encounter. His posture was rigid, shoulders tense as he nursed a glass of whiskey. But it wasn't just Kane who noticed the change. The other serpents were keeping their distance now. No laughter, no rowdy displays. Even the younger recruits seemed reluctant to approach their leader. It was clear. Razor's grip was slipping. But Kane also knew something Razor hadn't learned yet. A cornered man was often the most dangerous. And if Razor felt like he had nothing left to lose, the next confrontation wouldn't be about pride. It would be about revenge. And Kane was ready. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting golden streaks across the ocean as the ship glided forward. The tension Razor had brought onto this voyage seemed to ripple beneath the surface. Felt, but unspoken. Kane could feel it, an undercurrent of unease that followed him wherever he went, despite the hushed admiration from the passengers. He hadn't come here to be a hero, but now that's what people saw him as. And Razor? He was losing more than his reputation. Kane stood at the stern of the ship, watching the endless waves churn behind them. The scent of salt clung to the air, the ship's engines humming quietly beneath his feet. Razor hadn't shown himself in 2 days, not directly, anyway. Kane knew better than to believe the storm had passed. It was only a matter of time before he struck again. A quiet voice broke his thoughts. "Mr. Kane." "Officer Daniels." Kane turned to face the ship's head of security, who wore a grim expression beneath his professional mask. "We need to talk," Daniels said, gesturing for Kane to follow him toward a quieter section of the deck. When they reached the secluded area near the captain's lounge, Daniels folded his arms. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. "Razor has officially filed a complaint against you with the ship's administration, claims you've been instigating violence, threatening him, and even accused you of trying to intimidate his crew." Kane's expression didn't change. "And what's your assessment, Daniels? Do I seem like a man trying to pick fights?" Daniels shook his head. "No. But corporate policy is corporate policy. I've reviewed the footage, and while you've done nothing wrong, there's pressure. Management wants things calm. This ship isn't designed for conflict." Kane nodded. "I understand." Daniel shifted his weight, then spoke more quietly. "Listen, off the record, I saw what you did out there. You handled him with restraint. If it were me, Razor wouldn't be walking. But management wants this buried. They're giving me 2 options. Keep you both separated for the rest of the cruise, or remove one of you from the ship when we dock in port." Kane's jaw tightened. "And I'm guessing Razor's pushing for the latter?" Daniels gave a slow nod. "He's counting on you losing control. But he doesn't understand who he's dealing with, does he?" Kane exhaled slowly, controlling the simmering frustration in his chest. "No, he doesn't. But if you're asking me to let him win—" "I'm not," Daniels interrupted, voice firm. "But I need to know. If he provokes you again, can I trust you not to escalate it? Can you let me handle him next time?" For a long moment, Kane said nothing. Finally, he spoke with quiet certainty. "Daniels, I don't start fights, but I end them if I have to." Daniels studied him carefully, then extended a hand. "I'll keep you posted. Just be careful. He's not done." Later that evening, the captain's dinner. The gala hall was packed with elegantly dressed passengers, the air thick with the scent of roasted seafood and expensive wine. Conversations bubbled around the room as the captain himself made rounds, shaking hands and sharing stories. Kane stayed near the edges, a quiet observer as always. He wasn't here for spectacle, but he was here to make a point. Razor was across the room, watching him. No loud threats, no gang flanking him, just Razor, seated alone with a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him, his face a mask of forced calm. But Kane could see it clearly. Razor's world was unraveling. When the dinner service concluded, the captain himself addressed the crowd from the stage, thanking everyone for a wonderful voyage so far. But before the applause could die down, Razor stood up. The entire room fell silent as the Hell's Serpent leader raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, voice thick with sarcasm, "to the real tough guy on this ship, the one who thinks he's better than the rest of us, to John Kane, for making all the right enemies." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Razor smirked, clearly expecting Kane to rise, to react, to snap. But Kane didn't move. He stayed seated, calm, controlled. And when the silence lingered too long, Kane simply gave a slight nod. "Thank you for the toast, Razor. I hope you find peace." Razor's smirk faltered. The crowd didn't laugh. They didn't cheer him on. They looked uncomfortable, disapproving. He had played his final card, and it had failed. As the event dispersed, Daniels approached Kane one last time, his expression unreadable. "Well handled," Daniels said quietly. "You defused it without a word. Most people can't do that." Kane nodded. Restraint isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the loudest message you can send. But deep down, Kane knew it wasn't over yet. Razor was finished in the eyes of the crowd. But a man like him? He wouldn't go quietly. And Kane would be ready when he made his final move. The ship drifted peacefully under a velvet sky, the ocean's rhythmic pulse lulling most passengers into a sense of calm. But Kane could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface. The tension hadn't vanished, it had simply shifted. Razor had retreated from public displays, but a man like him didn't disappear without a plan. Kane was right to stay vigilant. It started during the mid-afternoon pool hours. Kane had been keeping to himself on a quiet section of the observation deck when a panicked voice reached his ears. "Stop! Please! Someone help!" His head snapped toward the sound immediately. The voice belonged to the young father, the man Kane had defended from Razor days earlier. His wife stood nearby, clutching their daughter as the man tried to reason with a looming figure in his path. "Razor." The biker had cornered the family near the pool's shallow end. No loud outbursts this time. No public displays of dominance. But Kane saw the danger in Razor's posture, leaning in too close, voice low and threatening. Kane was moving before his mind even finished processing. As he approached, Razor's words became clearer. "You think hiding behind that Marine makes you untouchable?" Razor hissed, his hand on the man's shoulder, squeezing just enough to make a point. "Maybe you ought to think twice before disrespecting men like me." The husband was trembling, shielding his daughter behind him. His voice shook as he replied, "Please, we just want to enjoy the trip. We haven't done anything to you." Kane's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Let him go." Razor turned slowly, releasing his grip. His face twisted into a grin, but the coldness behind his eyes was unmistakable. Well, right on cue, Razor spread his arms mockingly. "Here to play hero again, Marine? Or did you just miss the spotlight?" Kane's stance was calm but unyielding. "This isn't about me. It's about you targeting a family because you're too much of a coward to face your own failures." Razor's grin faded. His lips curled, jaw clenching as his hand flexed near his side. But Kane wasn't baiting him into violence. He was cornering him with truth. "Let me make this clear," Kane continued, voice low enough for Razor to feel the weight behind every word. "You don't touch them. You don't speak to them. If you so much as look in their direction again, you won't have to deal with ship security. You'll deal with me." Razor took a step forward, lowering his voice to a growl. "You threatening me, Marine?" Kane's voice remained steady. "No, I'm giving you your final warning." The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. Razor's fists curled tighter, his breath quickening. But then, something shifted. Passengers were watching. Razor noticed it too. Dozens of eyes, staring, murmuring. And Kane saw it click behind his eyes, Razor realizing once again that he had no control here. Razor spat on the deck at Kane's feet. "This ain't over." But this time, his voice lacked the bite. He turned and stormed off, shoving past his remaining men who lingered awkwardly, unsure whether to follow. Kane crouched down, turning his attention to the family. "Are you all right?" The father nodded shakily, exhaling a breath of relief. "Thank you. I didn't know what to do. He just came out of nowhere." Kane offered a reassuring nod. "You did the right thing standing your ground. Razor feeds on fear, but he's done here." The wife spoke next, her voice trembling. "He's not going to come back, is he?" Kane's expression hardened. "Not while I'm on this ship." Later, that evening, the mood on the ship had shifted. Whispers spread faster than the tide, passengers recounting how the Marine had stood between the bikers and an innocent family once again. But Kane wasn't celebrating. He knew Razor's type, and a man like that, when backed into a corner, became the most dangerous. Razor had lost his crew's respect, lost his control. But Kane could feel it. The next time Razor struck, he wouldn't be trying to intimidate. He'd be out for blood, and Kane would be ready. The sun dipped low on the horizon, streaking the ocean with hues of crimson and violet. The cruise ship glided peacefully forward, but Kane knew better than to be lulled by the calm. This wasn't peace. It was the silence before the storm. The confrontation earlier at the pool deck had shifted something, both in Razor and his crew. The bikers no longer gathered in large, loud packs. They moved separately now, avoiding eye contact, their usual bravado deflated. Kane had seen this fracture before. A leader losing his grip, followers questioning their loyalty. But Razor hadn't broken. Not yet. Kane stood on the observation deck as the evening breeze cooled his skin. His instincts were sharper than ever. Razor wasn't finished. He was waiting for something. And that something was coming tonight. 11:45 p.m. Crew access corridor lower deck. Kane had been waiting for over an hour. Not in his cabin. Not in the open. Razor wanted him cornered, so Kane had chosen the ground himself. The crew corridor was dimly lit, narrow and quiet, with the faint hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the walls. No cameras here, no guests, only steel bulkheads and low ceilings. Kane had chosen it for a reason. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Controlled. Kane remained perfectly still, breathing slow, steady. Razor entered the corridor alone. No gang, no backup. Just him, his face pale and tight, the bruise on his cheek still fresh from their last encounter. But there was no smirk this time. No insults. Just cold rage. Kane stepped from the shadows, his voice low and calm. "I was wondering when you'd come." Razor stopped a few feet away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think you've won, Marine? Think you humiliated me enough to scare me off?" Kane shook his head. "No, I don't think you're scared, Razor. I think you're desperate, and desperate men do stupid things." Razor's face twisted, teeth grinding audibly. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. You think you're better than me? Some kind of righteous soldier?" Kane's gaze stayed steady. "I'm not better, but I'm not the one threatening families, hurting innocent people. That's weakness, Razor, and deep down, you know it." The words hit their mark. Kane could see it, the slight flicker of doubt in Razor's eyes, the way his fists trembled. But Razor wasn't ready to surrender his pride. He lunged. This time, it wasn't a wild, emotional swing. It was calculated, faster, tighter. But Kane was faster. He sidestepped the blow with ease, deflecting Razor's wrist with a sharp, controlled block. Razor spun with the momentum, but Kane was already a step ahead, catching him by the shoulder and driving him backward into the steel bulkhead. The impact was solid. Razor grunted, struggling against Kane's iron grip. "This isn't who you have to be," Kane said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to go down like this." Razor spat. "Let me go." Kane released him. Razor staggered forward, coughing, his breath ragged. But instead of another strike, he pressed his back to the wall, shoulders heaving. For the first time, his voice dropped. Barely a whisper. "I'm not weak." Kane nodded. "I never said you were, but hurting people doesn't make you strong. Letting go of this?" He gestured to the tension still lingering between them. "That takes strength." Silence. Razor looked away, his face pale with frustration. For the first time since this began, the anger was fading. Kane could see it. He wasn't fighting Kane anymore. He was fighting himself. "Your men are already doubting you," Kane continued. "You can walk away from this. End it now, or you can keep pushing until there's nothing left of the respect you have left." Razor closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing his next move. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Kane exhaled, the tension finally releasing from his chest. It wasn't over completely. But tonight? Razor had reached his turning point, and Kane knew the battle was finally shifting toward its end. The ship drifted silently through the midnight ocean, the gentle sway of the waves rocking it into a deceptive calm. The last traces of the evening's festivities had faded. Most passengers retreated to their cabins, the hallways quiet. But Kane didn't trust the stillness. Not tonight. Razor had backed off earlier, but Kane knew better than to believe it was surrender. It wasn't over. Men like Razor didn't just let things go. They plotted. They regrouped. And when they felt cornered, they struck from the shadows. So Kane stayed ready. He sat quietly in his cabin, back against the wall, watching the door with calm focus. His breathing was steady, measured. His senses tuned to every sound outside, the subtle creak of the ship's hull, the occasional footsteps passing. And then it came. A faint shuffle just outside, the pause of movement. Kane rose silently. He didn't need a weapon. He was the weapon. The doorknob twisted. The lock clicked. And then, an explosion of movement. The door flew open, two dark figures rushing into the cabin. Kane didn't flinch. His instincts took over like a switch had flipped. The first attacker lunged, swinging wildly with a blackjack, clumsy, predictable. Kane shifted, catching the man's wrist mid-swing and twisting hard. The weapon dropped with a dull thud on the carpet as Kane spun him, slamming the assailant face first against the cabin wall. The second one hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. Kane saw the glint of metal. A knife. No hesitation. No room for mistakes. Kane surged forward, deflecting the blade with a quick parry, locking the man's arm under his own before driving his knee hard into the attacker's stomach. The breath whooshed out of him with a ragged gasp, the knife clattering harmlessly to the floor. Both were down, gasping. Kane didn't wait. He yanked the blackjack off the floor, tossing it out of reach, then kicked the knife under the bed. His voice was calm, controlled. "Who sent you?" The man against the wall spat blood, shaking his head. You know who." Kane narrowed his eyes. Razor. Of course, but not just a warning. This wasn't a message. It was an ambush. Footsteps thundered down the hall. More were coming. Kane released the pinned attacker and stepped back just as Razor himself stormed through the doorway, Tank trailing behind him with a pale face. "Kane!" Razor's voice was pure rage, fists clenched, breath ragged. "You think you can humiliate me? Make me look weak?" Kane didn't react, didn't rise. His heart was steady, his voice low. "You already made yourself look weak, Razor. I'm not your enemy. You are." Razor lunged. This time, Kane didn't just block. He stopped him. A single sidestep, a pivot. Kane caught Razor's wrist mid-punch and twisted it downward, hard. Razor dropped to one knee, snarling, but Kane didn't let go. The others hesitated. Even Tank. "You don't have to do this," Kane said through gritted teeth. "You're better than this." Razor roared, struggling, but Kane's grip held firm. "Look at your men, Razor," Kane shouted, his voice cutting through the struggle. "They're not backing you up. They're scared. Not of me, of what you're becoming." Razor froze. The silence was deafening. Tank stepped forward cautiously, voice trembling. "Boss, maybe it's enough. Let it go." Kane released Razor's wrist, pushing him back slightly. Razor slumped against the wall, chest heaving, his eyes wild with both rage and something else. Defeat. It was over. Kane spoke once more, voice quiet but powerful. "Walk away, Razor, while you still can." And this time, Razor didn't argue. He just left. And Kane knew he had finally won. The following day, the ship cut smoothly through the endless blue, the sun casting golden streaks across the waves. But beneath the surface calm, tension lingered like a silent current. Razor had been humiliated. Again. Not just in private, but in front of his own crew. His authority was shattered, his control slipping beyond repair. Kane knew Razor was nearing his breaking point. But he also knew that desperation made men unpredictable. It was late afternoon when the announcement echoed over the ship's speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, join us tonight for the grand entertainment showcase in the main theater. A night of music, performances, and guest appearances to close out your unforgettable voyage." Kane felt it immediately. Something wasn't right. Razor had retreated after their confrontation, barely seen since the night of the failed ambush. The crew had reported nothing further. But Kane wasn't fooled. Razor wasn't the type to go quietly. He was planning something. 7:45 p.m. The main theater. The theater was packed. Elegant chandeliers bathed the audience in warm light, and soft music played as guests settled into their seats. Families, couples, even Razor's remaining crew members were in attendance, scattered among the crowd but unusually subdued. Razor wasn't with them. Kane sat near the back, arms crossed, scanning every face in the room, waiting, watching. The performance began, soft piano music and dancers gliding gracefully across the stage. Applause rippled through the crowd as the first act concluded. And then, without warning, the lights dimmed. A voice crackled over the speakers. Unrehearsed, unfamiliar. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to dedicate this next part to someone who's been quite the hero on this trip." The room fell silent. Kane's muscles tensed. Razor stepped onto the stage. Dressed in his leather jacket, microphone in hand, his eyes scanned the crowd. His face was a mixture of forced confidence and barely concealed rage. "This cruise has been a dream, huh?" Razor said, voice echoing across the room. "5-star service, open bars, endless luxury. But you know what? It's missing something. A real show." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some were confused. Some were uncomfortable. Kane stood, moving closer. Razor continued, his voice dripping with mockery. We've had a lot of fun this week, but some people—" His gaze landed directly on Kane. "Think they can humiliate others. Think they can make someone feel small. But you see, there's only so much a man can take before he reminds you who he really is." The tension in the room was suffocating. Kane could feel the shift. This wasn't just an attention grab. Razor was trying to reclaim power. But then Razor's expression shifted, twisting into something darker. From his jacket, he pulled out a folded piece of paper and unfolded it. A photograph. It was of Kane. Not from the ship, but from years earlier. His Marine uniform. A medal pinned to his chest. Razor turned it toward the crowd. "You all see this man? You call him a hero, right? But do you even know what he's done? People like him. They don't just stop violence. They cause it." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Confusion, discomfort. Razor grinned wider. "See? People like him. They hurt people. They break things. And they call it discipline. But heroes? They don't humiliate people on vacation. They don't—" "Enough." Kane's voice cut through the noise like a gunshot. The crowd turned as Kane stepped forward, his presence commanding but calm. "You're right about one thing, Razor." Kane's voice echoed through the theater, his gaze locked on the biker. "I was a Marine. I've seen violence. I've had to fight men far more dangerous than you to protect the innocent. And you?" He shook his head. "You're just a coward trying to control people through fear." The crowd murmured louder now. The tension was shifting. Razor stepped back, his face pale but defiant. "You think you're better than me? You think this audience cares about—" "They don't," Kane interrupted, voice steady. "Because they see you for what you are. You're not here to entertain. You're here because you've already lost everything. Your control, your crew, their respect." Razor's face twisted with rage. Kane stepped closer. "You want to prove you're strong, Razor? Walk away, or show everyone here how weak you really are." The silence was crushing. Razor trembled, his fists curling, but he didn't move. The crowd was no longer on his side. And then, as if accepting his defeat, Razor dropped the microphone. The sound echoed as he turned and walked off the stage. No cheers, no applause, just silence. And in that silence, Kane knew Razor's power was finally broken. But there was one final chapter to be written. Kane wasn't just walking away, he was ending this. For good. The night air was heavy as the ship cut through calm, dark waters. The spectacle Razor had created in the theater lingered like an echo in the minds of every passenger. But instead of fear, there was only discomfort. Embarrassment. For him. Razor had lost. Not through violence, not through chaos, through humiliation. But Kane knew men like Razor didn't just break, they shattered. And tonight, the final pieces were beginning to fall apart. It was nearly midnight when Kane spotted him. Razor stood alone on the far end of the upper deck, leaning against the railing. The soft glow of the ship's exterior lights illuminated his face, and for the first time since their conflict began, Razor looked small. No crew, no threats, just a man unraveling. Kane approached slowly, his boots making a quiet echo against the deck's polished wood. Razor didn't flinch, didn't turn. "Razor!" The biker didn't respond, his knuckles pale as they gripped the railing tighter. The ocean breeze tugged at his jacket, his face hard but hollow. Kane stopped a few feet away, his voice calm but firm. "It's over. Whatever you're holding on to. It's done. Let it go before you lose everything." Razor's jaw clenched. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "You think I care what those people think? You think this matters?" Kane nodded slowly. "Yes, I think it does. I think it's mattered since the moment you felt you had to prove yourself to everyone. To me. To your crew. But this isn't strength." Razor finally turned. His face was pale, the defiant fire extinguished but not fully gone. I never needed their respect. I led my men because they feared me. That's how you keep control. Kane shook his head. No, that's how you lose it. And you already have. Razor's face twisted. You don't know me. You don't know what it took to get here, to survive. I had nothing. No one. If I wasn't the strongest in the room. Kane interrupted softly, stepping closer. That's not strength, Razor. That's pain, and it's eating you alive. The words struck deeper than any blow Kane had ever delivered. Razor's face crumbled for a split second, just long enough for the mask to slip. You have no idea, Razor whispered, voice breaking. Kane nodded. I do. I've been there. The need to stay in control, to bury pain behind toughness. But you're not winning anymore, Razor. You're just hurting yourself and everyone around you. Razor turned back to the sea, his head lowering. His grip on the railing tightened as though he was trying to crush it. But he didn't speak. Kane let the silence stretch. And then, finally, Razor exhaled a ragged breath. I don't know how to stop. Kane nodded slowly. You already have, right now, by standing here, by not fighting. That's the first step. Razor didn't move for a long moment. Then, finally, his hands relaxed from the railing. The tension drained from his shoulders. His chest heaved once, twice, as though a weight had finally begun lifting. Kane could feel it. The fight was over. But there was still one last loose end. Tomorrow, Kane said gently, you're going to talk to Daniels. Turn yourself in for what happened on this trip. Clean break. No more threats. No more violence. And when this ship docks, you leave this life behind. Understand? Razor swallowed hard, nodding once. And for the first time since this battle began, Kane saw it. The broken man behind the anger. Not a villain. Just a man who had finally run out of excuses. And with that, Kane turned and walked away. It was finished. At last. The sun rose gently over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pale gold and soft lavender. The ocean stretched endlessly around the ship, calm and quiet. But this morning, something felt different. Lighter. The tension that had weighed on the crews for days was gone. Kane stepped onto the deck early, the breeze cool against his face. He wasn't searching for Razor this time. There was nothing left to confront, nothing left to prove. But then, the unexpected happened. Razor approached him. No leather jacket, no smirk, no entourage flanking him like a protective wall. Just Razor, quiet, tired, but different. Kane didn't speak first. He let the silence linger. Razor finally broke it. His voice was low, strained. I talked to Daniels. Kane nodded but said nothing. Razor exhaled, shoulders slumping as he leaned against the railing. I told him everything. The threats, the stunts we pulled, even the ambush. Kane's eyes narrowed slightly. And? Razor shook his head, voice raw. They're letting me finish the trip. But Daniels said when we dock, I'm being reported to the Port Authority. Trespassing, harassment. I'm done. Kane nodded again, this time with more weight. It's the right call. Silence hung between them, the sound of the waves filling the space. And then Razor did something Kane never expected. He extended his hand, not as a challenge, not as a test of dominance, but in surrender. I'm not saying we're friends, Razor said quietly, but I was wrong. You didn't deserve what I did. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it anyway. Kane studied him for a long moment, the scars on Razor's knuckles, the tension still lingering in his jaw, but there was no defiance now, no mask. Finally, Kane clasped his hand firmly. I don't hold grudges, Razor, but it's not me you need to prove yourself to. Razor nodded, releasing the handshake. His voice softened. I will. I'm done with this. All of it. I don't know what's next, but I know I can't keep living like this. Kane gave a rare, faint smile. That's a start. Razor nodded, exhaling as though releasing the last of his pride into the wind. Then he turned, leaving Kane alone on the deck. But this time, it wasn't an act of defiance. It was freedom. Later that day, the pool deck. Passengers had begun to notice the shift. The Hell's Serpents had disbanded, no longer lingering in packs, no longer drawing attention. Some of Razor's crew had even started mingling quietly with the crowd, no longer hiding behind the group's intimidation tactics. Kane had returned to his quiet spot on the observation deck when Tank approached, a subtle hesitance in his steps. "Kane," he said carefully. Kane nodded, gesturing for him to speak. Tank shifted awkwardly, glancing down at the polished wood beneath his boots. "Look, I know we crossed lines, and I ain't asking for forgiveness either, but I wanted to say, I'm done with that life too." Kane raised a brow. "What made you change your mind?" Tank scratched the back of his neck. "Seeing Razor. Lose it. The way you handled yourself. I thought, maybe there's a better way than being the loudest guy in the room. Maybe strength ain't what I thought it was." Kane nodded slowly. "It isn't. Real strength. It's knowing when to walk away from a fight. You did that today." Tank exhaled, offering a small, almost awkward grin. "Yeah, guess I'm still figuring that out." Kane nodded. "We all are." The past few days had been stormy, intense, but as the sun set that evening, Kane finally felt it. The storm was over, and peace had finally returned. The final evening aboard the ship arrived, marked by the glow of lanterns reflecting off the calm ocean surface. The energy on board felt different now, lighter, calmer. Conversations were softer, laughter genuine, and for the first time since the voyage began, there was no lingering tension on the air. The Hell's Serpents were no longer a presence. Razor had retreated completely from public view. His men had scattered, some keeping to themselves, while others had quietly begun mingling with the other passengers, no longer a force of intimidation. Kane stood alone near the bow, hands resting on the cool railing, watching the sun slip beneath the endless horizon. The quiet felt earned, hard-won, but he knew the echoes of this confrontation would linger longer than the voyage. He heard the footsteps approaching before he turned. Officer Daniels. The security officer wore his usual professional expression, but there was a subtle ease in his posture tonight. Less tension, less guarded. Daniels cleared his throat. "Kane." Kane nodded. "Daniels." The officer shifted, then extended a hand. Kane accepted the shake, firm but respectful. "Razor and his crew?" Kane asked, voice calm but direct. Daniels nodded. "Handled. Razor filed his official statement. He's agreed to leave without incident when we dock tomorrow. No further threats. Tank and a few others have quietly distanced themselves, and most of the passengers seem at ease now." Kane gave a slow nod, his eyes returning to the sea. "Good." Daniels exhaled. "I have to say, I didn't expect this outcome. Most situations like this, they escalate. Someone always gets hurt. But you de-escalated it, and you did it the right way." Kane's expression remained calm, but there was a weight behind his words. "The right way doesn't always feel easy. I'm just glad no one else had to get hurt." Daniels hesitated for a moment, then added quietly, "We could use more men like you, Kane, in security work, leadership." Kane shook his head, the hint of a smile forming. "I had my time in the field. This trip was supposed to be a break from all that." Daniels chuckled softly. "Doesn't look like you're the type to stay on the sidelines." Kane didn't answer. He didn't need to. Some instincts never really faded. The final morning, docking port. The ship pulled into port just after sunrise. The coastline stretched wide, the harbor bustling with activity as the massive vessel prepared to unload its passengers. Kane watched from the observation deck, arms crossed as the final announcements echoed over the speakers. The journey was complete. But there was still one final moment. Razor appeared on the lower deck, escorted quietly by Daniels. No handcuffs, no public shaming. Just a quiet, defeated man leaving behind the wreckage of his own making. As he stepped onto the gangway, Razor glanced up, toward Kane. Their eyes met. No words exchanged, no challenges left, just a silent understanding. Razor turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Later, that morning, the captain's office. As Kane prepared to disembark, a staff member approached with a sealed envelope. "The captain asked me to deliver this personally," she said, offering a polite nod before leaving. Kane opened it carefully. Inside was a short, handwritten note on official ship stationery. "Mr. Kane, on behalf of the entire crew, I extend my gratitude for how you handled the difficult events during this voyage. Your integrity, restraint, and courage reflect the highest standards of leadership. Thank you for protecting not just our passengers, but our principals. Safe travels. Captain James Alcott." Kane folded the letter, slipping it into his jacket pocket. He hadn't come here seeking recognition. He hadn't wanted confrontation. But sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping into the fire anyway. And now, as he stepped off the ship and onto solid ground, Kane knew one truth. His mission was never truly over. It had just begun. The massive cruise ship loomed behind Kane as he stepped onto the dock, the scent of salt and sea air mixing with the sounds of bustling port activity. Sunlight reflected off the gentle waves, casting a golden glow over the end of what had been anything but a peaceful vacation. But now it was over. Passengers filed past him, their rolling suitcases echoing against the pavement, voices chattering excitedly about the memories they had made, sunsets, fine dining, and quiet moments with loved ones. But for many, the unforgettable memory wasn't the poolside cocktails or elegant galas. It was the Marine. Whispers lingered even as people departed. "That's him, the Marine who stood up to those bikers. He didn't just fight them. He stopped it all without violence. I heard he took down their leader with just his bare hands." Kane ignored the attention, keeping his stride steady as he walked toward the terminal gates. Stories had a way of being exaggerated. The truth didn't need embellishment. He hadn't come here to be a legend. He'd come for peace, and yet he could feel the weight of what had happened. Razor's downfall had become more than just a confrontation. It had turned into a lesson. For some, it was about strength. For others, it was about restraint. And for Kane, it was a reminder. Sometimes the battle wasn't about proving you could fight. It was about showing you didn't have to. Outside the port, terminal security station. Officer Daniels caught up with him just before he left the terminal. "Kane," he called out, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. Kane paused, accepting the handshake. Daniels looked more relaxed than before, the stress of managing the chaos finally behind him. "Razor?" Kane asked simply. Daniels nodded. "Gone, left quietly with his crew. I forwarded the full report to the port authorities. They won't be allowed back on our ships." Kane nodded. "Good. And the family?" Daniels smiled. "Safe. They asked me to thank you personally. The father said you taught him something about standing tall, even when it's hard." Kane's expression softened slightly. "I didn't teach him that," Kane replied. "He already had it in him." Daniels nodded respectfully. "Well, whether you want the credit or not, you made a difference here, and not just with them." Kane exhaled, glancing back at the massive ship behind them. The ocean had been calm, but the storm had raged aboard, and yet somehow peace had been restored. Daniels gave him a final nod. "Where to next?" Kane's gaze shifted to the horizon, the sun breaking fully free from the clouds. wherever I'm needed." Without another word, Kane turned, disappearing into the crowd, his presence lingering like a whisper, an echo of quiet strength, leaving behind a legend far greater than any confrontation. Because true strength wasn't about overpowering the enemy. It was about walking away with honor intact. And in the end, that was all Kane needed,